At a dinner with my husband's colleagues, one of them asked how we'd met. Julian grinned, a practiced charming motion, and said, "Oh, she wouldn't stop emailing me. A determined little thing." His friends chuckled. He added, layering on the false humility, "She was completely smitten, to be honest." I felt guilty saying no. More laughter echoed around the table. Then, with a flourish, now she trots after me like a puppy. I suppose I'm her greatest achievement. I held my smile, took a final sip of my wine, and made a silent vow that he would never ever humiliate me again. "Just look at my wife. She's like a prize-winning show dog, perfectly polished," Julian announced to his golf partners as I brought their drinks out to the patio, his hand clamping onto my waist with a sense of ownership. "She knows precisely when to talk, when to smile, and when to vanish. It took years of dedication, but I finally got her properly housebroken." The men roared with laughter while I kept my practiced smile firmly in place, but deep inside, something solidified into cold, hard clarity. This would be the last time Julian Vance would ever parade me around like a personal trophy. If you've ever been made to feel small by someone who was supposed to build you up, think about subscribing. It costs nothing, and it helps stories like this find their way to others who might need to hear them. Now, let's see what happens next. I placed the tray of whiskey and sodas on the table with a practiced elegance, ensuring each glass landed silently on its coaster. Richard Sterling, Julian's closest confidant from the investment firm, lifted his glass in a mocking salute. "You've got her impeccably trained, Jules. Mine still argues with my stock picks." Another wave of laughter washed over the patio. I felt Julian's fingers dig into my hip, a subtle command for me to join in. So I produced the tinkling laugh he preferred, a sound as hollow as a crystal bell. "You can run along now, darling," Julian said, patting my hip as if rewarding an obedient pet. "The men have business to discuss." I turned to go, catching a glimpse of myself in the sliding glass door. Blonde hair flawlessly coiffed, a designer sundress Julian had personally chosen, makeup just understated enough to pass his inspection. Every single part of me was curated, managed, and trimmed down to fit his precise specifications. In the kitchen, I focused on my breathing as I loaded the dishwasher. Through the window, I could see them on the patio, Julian gesturing animatedly, likely spinning another tale where I was the punchline. 7 years. For 7 years, I had inhabited this role, each day chipping away a tiny piece of the woman I was before I became Mrs. Julian Vance. The clock on the stove read 2:47 p.m. In a little over 3 hours, I'd need to begin preparing for tonight's corporate dinner. Another performance where I would smile vacantly as Julian's colleagues pontificated about markets I understood more deeply than they ever would, discussing strategies I could have refined if anyone had ever bothered to ask for my input. But they never did. Why would they? I was just Julian's pretty wife, his most impressive accomplishment, taming a wild creature into submission. I went up the stairs to our bedroom, my hand gliding along the expensive banister Julian had selected because it looked good in photos from their dinner parties. Everything in our sprawling penthouse had been chosen for its appearance, for the statement it would make to others, including me, especially me. Inside the walk-in closet, I pushed past the rows of designer dresses Julian had approved and reached for the hidden panel I'd had installed 2 years prior. Behind it was a small, secret alcove where I kept the artifacts of my former self. My MBA diploma from Stanford, carefully rolled and tied with a silk ribbon, my CPA license, a stack of business cards from Apex Strategy Partners, the consulting firm I had built from the ground up and then surrendered for what I had mistaken for love. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. 3 years ago, standing in Isabel's office, signing the documents that would transfer majority ownership to her. "This is only temporary, Charlotte," Isabel had said, her eyes filled with concern. "You'll come back." But I had been so sure back then, so utterly convinced that Julian needed me to be smaller so he could feel bigger. "It's awkward having my wife competing in my own world," he had said after a mutual client chose my proposal over his. "It makes me look weak. You get that, don't you, darling?" I had gotten it. I'd understood that to love Julian meant shrinking myself to fit into the tiny box he allotted for me. I'd understood that his fragile ego demanded my diminishment. I had understood everything except for the staggering cost to my own soul. From downstairs, I heard the patio door slide open and the sound of men's voices in the foyer. They were leaving. I quickly shut the hidden panel and chose the navy cocktail dress Julian had sanctioned for tonight. A conservative neckline, an appropriate hemline. Expensive enough to broadcast his success, but not so extravagant as to hint that I might have my own resources. He had no idea about the trust fund my grandmother had left me, the one I had never touched, the one that was quietly accumulating interest while I performed the role of the financially dependent wife. Charlotte. Julian's voice boomed up the staircase. "Come say goodbye to the guys." I descended the stairs with measured steps, my vacant smile plastered back on my face. Richard was waiting by the door, his gaze sliding over me with the casual appraisal that men like him feel they're entitled to. "Stunning as ever, Charlotte. Julian's a lucky man." "The luckiest," Julian agreed, yanking me against his side with a proprietary grip. Though between us, it wasn't luck, just excellent training, more laughter. Richard clapped him on the shoulder and departed. Once the door was closed, Julian turned to me, his expression immediately shifting to the critical evaluation I knew so well. "Your laugh was a bit forced out there. We've been over this. It needs to sound feminine, not theatrical. Tonight is critical. Richard Sterling will be there with his wife, and I'm on the short list for the Singapore project. I need you to be flawless." "Of course," I replied, my voice pitched at the exact frequency he preferred. "And remember the story," he went on, adjusting my simple pearl necklace with clinical detachment. "You pursued me. You were relentless. I eventually gave in out of kindness. That's the narrative they believe, so that's the one you reinforce. Can you manage that without making a mess of it?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak in my practiced, gentle tone. He kissed my forehead, a gesture that once felt affectionate, but now felt like a brand of ownership on property. "Good girl. Go start getting ready. We leave at 7 sharp." As he walked off toward his study, I stood alone in our vast, cold foyer, surrounded by the beautiful cage he had meticulously constructed for me. Tonight, he would tell his degrading story once more. Tonight, his colleagues would laugh at my expense once more. Tonight, I would smile and play the part of his perfectly trained achievement once more. Or would I? I climbed the stairs again, but this time, my purpose was different. From the hidden panel, I retrieved my old laptop, the one Julian knew nothing about. As it hummed to life, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a forgotten confidence, logging into accounts I had kept active but dormant. Contact lists, client databases, the complete financial records of Apex strategy partners. It was all still there, waiting. Just like the woman I used to be, buried somewhere beneath the surface of Julian's creation. The clock showed 3:22 p.m., less than 4 hours until dinner. 4 hours to prepare for yet another performance as Mrs. Julian Vance, devoted wife and greatest achievement. But as I shut the laptop and started to dress, I knew something had changed. That moment of clarity on the patio hadn't been just anger or hurt. I had learned to bury those emotions long ago. It was understanding. The simple, perfect realization that I had been living as someone else's achievement for long enough. Tonight would be different, though Julian wouldn't know it yet. Tonight, while I smiled and nodded and played my part, I would be taking notes. Not the kind that helped me remember his colleagues' wives' names or their children's allergies. The kind that would help me remember who I was before I became what he had made me. The navy dress slipped over my shoulders like armor disguised as silk. The valet took Julian's car keys with the reverence reserved for patrons who tipped extravagantly. Julian's hand pressed into my lower back, steering me toward the restaurant entrance with the same proprietary force he'd used to guide an expensive vehicle into a tight parking spot. Through the heavy glass doors, I could already see the opulent glow of the dining room and hear the low hum of conversations that would soon use my degradation as a form of entertainment. Shoulders back, Julian murmured into my ear as we neared the hostess stand. "And remember to let me do the talking tonight. Richard is thinking about me for the Singapore expansion, and I can't have any distractions." The hostess, a young woman with a name tag that read Sophia, beamed when she saw Julian. "Mr. Vance, your regular table is prepared. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling have already arrived." Her gaze flickered over me without a hint of recognition, as if I were merely a high-end accessory Julian had brought with him. Maybe that's all I was. The restaurant was buzzing with the controlled, expensive energy of places with three-figure entrees and year-long waiting lists. Julian navigated the room with practiced ease, nodding at other diners he knew, his hand never leaving the small of my back. I saw several faces I recognized from his firm, from charity galas, from the endless dinners where I had mastered the art of being seen but not heard. Richard Sterling rose as we approached, his silver hair glinting under the massive chandelier. His wife, Victoria, remained seated, her eyes conducting a slow, critical scan of my dress, starting at my shoes and moving deliberately upward. Her expression broadcasted her opinion of my choice long before she offered a greeting. The navy dress, the one Julian had approved, suddenly felt like a cheap costume for a role I was miscast in. Julian, Richard's handshake was the kind men perfect in business school, firm, confident, and held for a fraction of a second too long, and the lovely Charlotte. The way he said lovely made it clear it was a platitude, not a compliment. "Victoria, you look stunning," I said, taking my assigned seat. She was wearing a current season Saint Laurent, and I mentally calculated that her earrings alone were worth more than Julian knew I had in my personal bank account. "Thank you, dear," Victoria replied, her smile failing to reach her eyes. "That's a very classic dress." It was code for boring, uninspired, everything Julian wanted me to be. "She doesn't need all that flash," Julian said, already flagging down the waiter for drinks. "Natural beauty and all that." He said it like he was defending a purchase, explaining his choice of a practical model over a luxury one. Richard was already deep into a story about firm gossip when our drinks were served. A martini for me, ordered by Julian without consulting my preference. Whiskey neat for him and Richard. A single glass of white wine for Victoria, which she held like a prop she had no intention of using. "The Mitchell deal is a complete train wreck," Richard was saying, his voice laced with the casual cruelty of successful men discussing the failures of others. But it's no surprise given Tom's recent, personal issues. Julian let out a calculated laugh, designed to show he was in on the joke without appearing too eager. I sipped my martini, letting their voices fade into a background hum, and noticed how Victoria was watching me with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for spotting a counterfeit designer bag. "Speaking of personal issues," Richard said, his attention suddenly swiveling to me with the weight of a spotlight. "How did you two actually meet? I don't think I've ever gotten the full story." My mouth opened, ready to tell the real story. The conference where I had presented on disruptive market strategies, Julian approaching me afterward with a nervous energy, his business card trembling in his hand. But Julian's hand found my knee under the table, a warning squeeze that meant, "Be silent." "Oh, this is a great one," Julian said, his grin spreading like an oil slick. "She wouldn't stop emailing me, a very persistent little thing." He chuckled, and Richard joined in immediately. "I mean, we're talking dozens of messages a day. I'd wake up to these long manifestos about why we needed to have coffee." My fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of my martini glass. This wasn't just a lie, it was a complete fabrication of our history. I had never emailed him first. He had pursued me relentlessly for 6 months. She was obsessed, honestly, Julian continued, warming to his performance. Victoria's expression had shifted from cold assessment to something that looked uncomfortably like pity. I felt bad saying no. You know how it is with some women. Sometimes charity is the only decent option. Julian, I said quietly, but he was already lost in his act. The best part, he said, his hand now resting on my shoulder as if presenting evidence, is that now she follows me around like a puppy, goes where I go, does what I say. Guess I'm her best achievement, right, darling? The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering with malice. Richard howled with laughter. Victoria's smile was now fixed, a brittle thing. At nearby tables, conversations had quieted, the way people do when they sense a shift in a room's dynamics without knowing why. My martini glass remained perfectly still in my hand. My smile never faltered, but inside something fundamental gave way, like tectonic plates finally breaking apart after years of mounting pressure. I saw our entire marriage reframed in that single horrifying moment. Every put-down, every public correction, every time he had rewritten our history to make himself the hero and me the grateful charity case. "That's quite a story," Victoria said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that suggested she wasn't buying it. "Isn't it?" I replied, my voice perfectly calibrated to Julian's preferred tone. Julian has such a talent for fiction. He squeezed my shoulder, pleased with what he interpreted as my compliance. "Well, you know what they say," Richard added. "Behind every successful man is a devoted woman." Or beneath him, Garrett chimed in with a crude laugh that made my skin crawl. The waiter's arrival with our appetizers was a merciful interruption. I arranged my napkin in my lap with robotic precision as my mind raced, running calculations Julian couldn't even fathom I was capable of. The trust fund he knew nothing about. The business contacts he thought I'd lost. The parts of myself I had buried so deeply that I had almost forgotten they existed. Through the soup course, Richard explained market fluctuations to me using simplified sports analogies, while Victoria asked about my hobbies in the patronizing tone one uses with a small child. Julian's hand remained possessively on my arm, squeezing occasionally to signal when I should laugh or smile. Each touch felt like another steel bar being welded onto the cage I had helped him construct. "You're so fortunate," Victoria said as our entrees arrived. "Having Julian handle everything, make all the tough decisions. It must be so relaxing not having to think too much." "Exactly," Julian agreed before I could speak. "She's much happier now that she doesn't have to worry her pretty little head about complicated things. Aren't you, darling?" I looked at him then, really looked at him. The smug smile, the casual confidence of a man who fully believed his own propaganda. He genuinely thought he had done me a favor by erasing me. "The happiest," I said, raising my glass in a small, silent toast to myself. The rest of dinner was a blur of calculated smiles and perfectly timed laughter. I mentally cataloged every slight, every dismissive gesture, every moment Julian's fictional narrative of our life grew more elaborate and more degrading. By the time dessert arrived, my decision had been made, not out of anger or hurt, but with a cold, perfect clarity. Julian would never humiliate me again, not because I would stop him, but because I would stop being the woman he thought he had created. The real Charlotte Hayes was still in there, waiting just beneath the polished surface of Mrs. Julian Vance. The house settled into a deep quiet as Julian's rhythmic snoring began to drift from our bedroom. I waited another 20 minutes, counting the seconds between his breaths to be certain he was in the deep 11:47 p.m. when I finally moved, my bare feet making no sound on the cold marble of the kitchen floor. I slipped through the living room, carefully avoiding the floorboard that always creaked near the bookshelf, and entered the guest bedroom we had converted into Julian's home office. He called it his command center, but tonight it was my war room. The imposing mahogany desk sat in the moonlight filtering through the blinds, its drawers locked, as always. Julian didn't know I'd had copies of his keys made months ago during one of his weekend golf trips. The bottom drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside, beneath folders of tax returns and investment portfolios, my fingers found the slim manila envelope I had hidden there 3 years ago. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled out the documents Julian had never seen, the ones he would never think to look for in his own inner sanctum. The trust fund statement showed a balance that would make his eyes water. My grandmother's final gift to me, meticulously invested and steadily growing. $9.2 million that he believed didn't exist because I had let him believe my family was ordinary, struggling, and middle class. Beneath the statement lay my Stanford MBA diploma, the gold seal still gleaming in the dim light. And under that, 3 job offer letters from Fortune 500 companies, each proposing a salary that dwarfed what Julian was making even now. I had declined them all. For him, for us, for a love that demanded I be less so he could feel like more. I carefully put everything back in its hiding place and moved to Julian's computer. He thought his password was so clever. Our anniversary date. Backward. He never imagined I was paying close enough attention to have figured it out. The screen flickered on and I navigated to the folders he thought were safely hidden behind work presentations and client reports. What I discovered made my breath catch in my throat. Spreadsheets labeled personal security showed a systematic siphoning of funds from our joint accounts into an account solely in his name. $50,000 here, $30,000 there. Amounts just small enough to avoid triggering bank alerts but adding up to a substantial sum. Over the past 2 years, he had drained nearly $400,000. My money. The inheritance from my father that I had naively added to our joint savings, trusting him completely to manage our finances. The emails were even worse. Chains of conversations with his lawyer friend Daniel discussing asset protection strategies and preemptive financial planning. One message, dated just 6 months ago, was chillingly clear. Need to ensure C remains financially dependent. Can't have her getting any ideas about independence. The moment they think they don't need us, they're gone. My phone vibrated on the desk, startling me out of my stupor. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in years, Isabel Rossi, my former business partner. My hand hesitated for a long moment before I answered. Charlie? Her voice was a little slurred, the clatter of a busy bar in the background. I know it's late. I'm sorry, I had to tell you something. Isabel, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's wrong. God, I'm drunk. She let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. I kept your name on the major contracts, Charlie. 3 of them. The big ones. Morrison Industries, the Hartley Group, and that pharmaceutical giant. You still own 40% of the firm. The room seemed to tilt. What are you talking about? I signed the papers. I never filed the transfer documents. I kept telling myself it was just an oversight, but I knew. I knew he was crushing you, and I knew you'd need an escape hatch eventually. She paused, and I heard the clink of ice in a glass. The firm is worth $12 million now, Charlie. Your 40% is just sitting here, waiting for you to come home. My legs felt like they couldn't support me. I sank into Julian's expensive leather chair. Isabel, Don't say anything now. Just know that it's here. You're still listed as co-founder and senior partner on a leave of absence. The door is wide open whenever you're ready to walk back through it. She hung up before I could form a response. I sat in the darkness, my mind a whirlwind of calculations and possibilities. Julian had been systematically stealing from me, all while I was sitting on a fortune he couldn't even imagine. The irony was almost comical, except nothing about this felt funny. At 2 a.m., I found myself driving through the deserted streets toward the city's industrial district. The storage facility was empty, save for the harsh security lights casting long, distorted shadows. Unit 47B. I hadn't set foot in here in over a year, but the key was still on my ring, hidden amongst the others. The metal door groaned as it rolled up, the sound deafening in the silence. Inside, illuminated by a single bare bulb, were the archaeological remains of my former existence. cardboard boxes labeled in my neat script. Awards, client files, office photos, garment bags hanging on a portable rack held my old business suits, Armani, Chanel, the armor of a woman who had once commanded boardrooms. I opened the first box and pulled out a crystal plaque, Entrepreneur of the Year, Charlotte Hayes. Another read, Excellence in Strategic Consulting. My fingers traced the engraved letters of a name that no longer felt like my own. Beneath the awards, I found photo albums from company retreats, pictures of me shaking hands with CEOs, speaking at conferences, laughing with clients who had valued my mind. The laptop was in the third box, wrapped in bubble wrap like a precious relic. I powered it on, amazed the battery still held a charge. The screen blinked to life, showing a desktop frozen in time, email contacts for hundreds of clients, proposals I had written, strategic plans that had saved companies millions. All of it, waiting patiently. At the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of old files, was a birthday card. The handwriting was my mother's, a bit shaky but firm. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years, not since Julian had convinced me she was a toxic influence, jealous of our perfect life. The card was from my last birthday before the silence. Inside, she had written, "My darling girl, I hope someday you remember who you were before him. You were magnificent. You still are. Love, Mom." I sat on the cold concrete floor of that storage unit, surrounded by the evidence of a life I had willingly abandoned, and felt something crack open inside of me. Not break. It was like a seed that had lain dormant for years, finally sensing the first warmth of spring. These weren't just objects. They were proof. Proof that I had been a whole person before Julian. Proof that I had been accomplished, respected, and valued for my intellect, not just for my compliance. I loaded several boxes into my car, including the laptop and a garment bag containing my favorite suit, a black Saint Laurent that had always made me feel invincible. As I drove home through the pre-dawn gloom, I thought about the night's revelations, Julian's financial betrayal, Isabel's quiet act of loyalty, my mother's patient hope. Each discovery was a single thread, and together they were weaving themselves into something that looked a lot like a rope, or maybe a ladder. Back at home, I hid everything in the guest room closet behind winter coats we never used. Julian was still snoring, oblivious to my absence, to my discoveries, to the woman who was quietly reassembling herself in the margins of his perfectly controlled world. I slipped back into bed beside him. My body was cold from the night air, but my mind was on fire with possibilities. He stirred, his arm reaching for me out of habit, pulling me into a possessive embrace even in his sleep. I lay there, feeling the weight of his arm like a chain, and I began to plan. Morning arrived with the shrill sound of Julian's 6:30 a.m. alarm. His hand immediately reached across the bed to make sure I was still there before he got up for his shower. I lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his morning ritual, then slipped out of bed to make his breakfast. My movements were on autopilot. 2 eggs, over easy, whole wheat toast, freshly squeezed orange juice. But my mind was a million miles away, calculating the hours until my 10 o'clock meeting. I had told Julian I had a hair appointment. He had just nodded, already engrossed in market reports on his phone, and tossed his credit card on the counter. "Don't go overboard," he'd said, his standard warning whenever I spent money, even on the maintenance he himself required. The coffee shop where I met Diane Foster was deliberately chosen, 20 miles from Julian's office, in a quiet neighborhood he would never deign to visit. Diane looked just as she had 3 years ago when I'd saved her company $2 million with a complete restructuring plan. Her eyes widened when she saw me, then softened with a look that was part pity, part relief. "Charlotte Hayes," she said, deliberately using my maiden name. "I was wondering if I'd ever see you again." We sat in a corner booth far from the windows. I wrapped my hands around the warm coffee mug, letting it anchor me to this moment, this decision. "I'm considering a return to consulting," I said carefully, watching for her reaction. Diane leaned back, studying me over the rim of her glasses. Considering? or deciding? Testing the waters, I replied. She stirred her coffee slowly, choosing her words. Your husband came to see me last year. Did you know that? He tried to pitch his firm's services, said he could offer much better rates than our current advisors. My face remained a neutral mask, but inside, a knot tightened. I wasn't aware. He was unprepared, Diane said, pausing delicately. Arrogant. He actually told me that women-owned businesses like mine needed masculine strategic thinking to truly thrive. I had my assistant show him out after 20 minutes. The coffee suddenly tasted acidic. Julian had never mentioned this meeting, never mentioned the humiliating rejection, but it explained the period of increased irritability last spring, his cutting remarks about female executives being diversity hires. He had no idea about our history, Diane continued. No clue that you had personally restructured my entire operation. When I mentioned your name, he actually laughed. He said you were just playing at business before you met him. I set my cup down, meticulously controlling the tremor in my hands. I see. Diane reached across the table, her fingers briefly touching mine. Your strategic mind saved my company, Charlotte. If you're really coming back, I have 3 major projects waiting for you. Real money, real challenges. Are you interested? Yes, I said, the word escaping my lips before I could second guess it. After leaving Diane, I drove to a small business district in Riverside, where I had already leased a modest office suite under the name C. Hayes Consulting. The space was simple, 1 room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking a quiet street. It was nothing like the glass-walled corner office I had once occupied, but it was mine. I spent an hour setting up the essentials: a new laptop purchased with my hidden funds, business cards with my name and raised lettering, and a single defiant orchid on the desk. I then opened business accounts at 3 different banks, carefully transferring funds from my trust. I was building my financial independence piece by piece. By noon, I was back in the penthouse, preparing Julian's preferred lunch for the rare days he worked from home: a turkey sandwich, no mayo, with the lettuce on the side so it wouldn't get soggy. I was just placing it on a plate when my phone rang. Victoria Sterling. Charlotte, darling, are you free for lunch tomorrow? There's a new place in Westmont I'm dying to try. Victoria had never invited me anywhere without Julian. My first instinct was to refuse, but something in her tone made me hesitate. Of course. What time? The next day, Victoria was already at the table when I arrived, a half-empty glass of wine in front of her despite it being barely noon. She looked different without Richard by her side, smaller, more human, less like a perfectly curated accessory. I need to tell you something, she said without any preamble as I sat down, about Julian. My spine went rigid, but I kept my voice level. Oh? 2 years ago at the firm's Christmas party, I saw him with his secretary in the coat room. They weren't discussing quarterly reports. She took a long sip of her wine. I just assumed you knew. The way you always smile through everything, I thought you had one of those arrangements. You know, where the wives look the other way in exchange for the lifestyle? The room felt like it was tilting. Megan, 23-year-old Megan, with her accounting degree and her nervous laugh. I had personally trained her on Julian's coffee preferences, his filing system, his meeting schedule. She had even sent me a thank you card. I didn't know, I said quietly. Victoria's composed face crumpled slightly. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I just thought... Richard says all the wives know and just pretend they don't. It's apparently standard procedure at the firm. Standard procedure. My husband's infidelity was standard procedure. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Victoria signaled the waiter for another wine. Because last week at your dinner, when he told that awful story about you chasing him, I saw your face. I really saw it. And I recognized something I see in my own mirror every single morning. We sat in a shared silence for a moment. 2 women trapped in very similar gilded cages, a silent recognition passing between us like a secret handshake. 3 days later, I was sitting in Laura Chen's office. a modest space in a strip mall 40 minutes from my home. Laura was not what I had expected from a top divorce attorney. No intimidating power suit, no massive desk. She wore a simple cardigan and had kind eyes that had clearly seen too many women in my exact position. "Tell me about your situation," she said simply. I laid it all out. The hidden trust fund, the business partnership Isabel had preserved, the systematic financial theft Julian had committed, his affair, the years of emotional degradation. Laura took notes in a neat, precise hand, nodding occasionally. "I have to tell you something," she said when I had finished. "This isn't Julian's first marriage." My breath caught. He was engaged before, 8 years ago. It ended with a sealed settlement, which usually means a significant amount of money changed hands to ensure privacy. I did some digging. The woman's name was Rebecca Shaw. She now lives in Seattle and runs a highly successful marketing firm. Laura slid a folder across the desk. I reached out to her discreetly. She couldn't say much because of the settlement terms, but she did say one thing. Tell her to document everything and to get out before he breaks her completely. The words hung in the air between us. I wasn't the first woman Julian had tried to grind down into nothing. I was just the current one. Laura leaned forward. "Charlotte, between your trust fund, your business partnership, and what we can prove about his financial deceptions, you have a significant amount of power here. More than you realize. The question is, what do you want?" What did I want? For the first time in years, I allowed myself the luxury of asking that question. "I want to be free," I said, "and I want him to know that I was never, ever what he thought I was." Laura smiled then, a sharp, understanding expression. "Then let's make that happen." I left her office with a concrete plan forming, the pieces clicking into place like a complex puzzle I had been solving without even realizing it. That evening, I made Julian's favorite dinner, coq au vin with roasted root vegetables, and listened to him complain about a client who had dared to question his judgment. "Some people just don't know their place," he said, cutting his chicken with unnecessary force. "No," I agreed, refilling his wine glass. "They certainly don't." Julian set his fork down with a loud, deliberate clatter. The sound was sharp against the expensive china. He stared at the salmon I had prepared for him, his expression twisting from annoyance to outright disgust. "This is overcooked," he announced, pushing the plate away from him. "How many times have I told you? Salmon should be pink in the center. This is basic, Charlotte. A child could manage this." I looked at the perfectly cooked piece of fish, its interior the exact shade of coral that my culinary instructor at Le Cordon Bleu would have praised. But mentioning my professional culinary training would only escalate his temper, which had been on a hair trigger for weeks since his latest big deal had imploded. "I'll make you something else," I offered, already rising from my chair. "Don't bother. I'll get something at the club." He stood, yanking his tie straight with a sharp, angry tug. Maybe they can manage to prepare a simple meal without completely ruining it. After he stormed out, I sat alone at our vast dining table, staring at the abandoned plates. The salmon was perfect. We both knew it. But my perfection had become just another weapon in his arsenal, something to deny me even when the evidence was sitting right in front of him. The next morning, Julian found me reading in the living room, a new biography of Katharine Graham I'd picked up. "A bit of a pretentious choice," he commented, not even glancing at the cover. "You do realize she ran the Washington Post, right? That requires actual business acumen and actual education. A little ambitious for someone who never even finished college, don't you think?" I closed the book carefully, the weight of my 3 degrees burning like hidden embers in my chest. "I'm just interested in successful women," I said mildly. "Successful women," he repeated with a hollow laugh. "Right. Well, when you actually accomplish something worth reading about, you let me know." He was leaving for work earlier and returning later these days. His shirt sometimes carried the faint scent of an unfamiliar perfume. Not Megan's nervous floral scent, but something more expensive, more deliberate. I had stopped asking about his evenings. His lies had become lazy and careless, as if he no longer felt I was worth the effort of a decent deception. That Thursday afternoon, I was arranging flowers in the foyer when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a figure I hadn't expected. My mother, Ellen, standing on the doorstep with a small suitcase and an expression of determined worry. I opened the door slowly as if she might vanish. "Mom." "I drove straight through," she said simply. 6 hours. I just had a feeling. We stood in silence for a moment, two women separated by 2 years of Julian-orchestrated silence. Then she stepped forward and wrapped me in an embrace that smelled of lavender and homemade bread, the scent of the life I had before Julian convinced me it was provincial and embarrassing. I made tea while she settled at the kitchen counter, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The pristine, sterile surfaces, the complete absence of personal photos, the way I moved through the space like a guest, careful not to disturb anything. "You look thin," she said finally, "and tired, but mostly you just look empty." The tears came without warning, silent streams running down my face as I stood frozen, the kettle in my hand. My mother stood and gently took it from me, setting it on the counter. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly, "what has he done to you?" We sat in the living room for over an hour as the words poured out of me. Not everything, not the worst parts, but enough. She didn't interrupt or judge. She just held my hand while I unburdened myself. Finally, she spoke. "I kept your room exactly as you left it. Your old desk, your books, everything. When you're ready to leave him, my door is open, no questions, no timeline, just open. Mom, You don't have to decide anything right now," she said firmly. "Just know that you have somewhere to go, someone who remembers who you really are." She left before Julian got home, but her presence lingered in the house like a promise. 2 days later, I was at the gym, working out my frustration on the elliptical, when Megan appeared beside me. Julian's secretary looked terrified, glancing around as if he might materialize from behind the weight machines. "Mrs. Vance," she began, then stopped. "Charlotte, I have to tell you something." I slowed my pace, studying her. She was wringing her hands, her usual nervous habit amplified. "It's about Mr. Vance." "Julian, I've been wanting to say something for months, but I was so scared of losing my job. What about him?" I kept my voice neutral, but my pulse began to race. "He's been sabotaging you," she blurted out. "I've heard him on calls telling people you're unstable, that you have mental health issues, that you're unreliable. He turned down 3 job inquiries that came in for you last month alone, people calling about consulting positions. He told them you weren't interested, that you couldn't handle the pressure." The sounds of the gym faded to a dull roar. "He's been taking my calls." Megan nodded miserably. "He had the IT department redirect all your professional emails to his account. I saw him delete an invitation for you to speak at a Women in Business conference. He laughed about it. He told someone on the phone, 'She's nothing without me, and I'm making sure it stays that way.'" My hands gripped the elliptical handles until my knuckles turned white. "How long? At least a year. Maybe longer. I'm so sorry. I should have said something sooner, but I didn't know how, and he's just so controlling and—" "Thank you for telling me," I managed, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. Megan shifted uncomfortably. "There's more. He's been telling people at the firm that you're having a sort of breakdown. He's setting up a narrative for if you ever try to leave him, making sure no one would believe you or hire you." After Megan scurried away, I sat in my car in the parking garage, the engine off, trying to absorb the sheer scale of his deception. This was beyond control, beyond diminishment. This was systematic destruction. He had been actively dismantling my future while I was at home cooking his dinners and organizing his life. That evening, I accessed our home computer while Julian was in the shower. Using skills from a coding course I had taken years ago, I found the email forwarding rules he had set up. And there they were, dozens of redirected messages, job offers, speaking engagements, former clients trying to reconnect, all routed directly to Julian's personal account and then deleted. One email from a Fortune 500 CEO I had once advised was particularly painful. "Charlotte, I've been trying to reach you for months. We have a senior strategy position that would be perfect for you. Please call me." It was dated 6 months ago, deleted the same day it arrived. I documented everything, taking screenshots and forwarding copies to my new private email account. The betrayal sat like a block of ice in my chest. Not hot anger, but cold, crystalline clarity. He hadn't just belittled me, he had actively worked to destroy any possibility of my independence, creating a prison while telling me I was free to leave anytime I wanted. The shower shut off upstairs. I quickly closed everything, returning the screen to his market analysis spreadsheet. When Julian came downstairs, I was in the kitchen, preparing his evening coffee exactly as he liked it. "You look tense," he observed, taking the cup without a word of thanks. "Just tired," I replied, watching him sip the coffee I had made perfectly, knowing that he would still find some fault with it. "Maybe you should take something for that," he suggested casually. "You've seemed a little unstable lately, very emotional. I've been worried about your mental state." And there it was, the narrative Megan had warned me about being tested out in our own kitchen. I smiled the empty smile I had perfected over 7 years. "You're probably right," I agreed. "I should take better care of myself." Julian settled into his leather armchair with his evening scotch, scrolling through his phone while I cleared the dinner plates. His smug self-satisfaction filled the room like a cheap, suffocating cologne. I moved quietly into the kitchen, then slipped into the small pantry where I had hidden my new phone, one he didn't know existed, purchased with cash from my hidden accounts. For the past week, I had been building something Julian would never suspect I was capable of creating, a comprehensive evidence portfolio. The phone contained everything: screenshots of his illicit financial transfers, showing the systematic theft from our joint accounts, audio recordings of his daily humiliations, captured by a voice recorder app I activated each morning before he woke. Our state was a single-party consent state for recordings, a detail I had meticulously confirmed with Laura. Every cruel comment, every lie about my education, every single moment he diminished me was now preserved in digital amber. I had also gathered written testimonies. Diane Foster had provided a formal statement about Julian's failed pitch and his dismissive comments about my business acumen. Megan had secretly forwarded me copies of the emails Julian had intercepted and deleted. Even Victoria had agreed to confirm what she knew about his affairs, though she warned me she could only go so far without jeopardizing Richard's career. The photo gallery held images of my real documents, my degrees, my trust fund statements, the partnership papers from Isabel's firm. Every single piece of evidence was backed up to 3 different cloud services under accounts Julian would never think to look for. I'd learned from his own deception: always have contingencies. The next morning was Thursday Country Club Day. I dressed carefully in the coral sundress Julian approved of, the one that made me look appropriately feminine without trying too hard, as he put it. The club's dining room was buzzing with its usual mix of business gossip and personal scandals, the currency of the wealthy and bored. I positioned myself at a table with Margaret Whitman and Jennifer Cross, 2 women whose talent for spreading information far exceeded their tennis skills. They were already 2 mimosas deep when I arrived, their voices at that particular pitch that signals the impending exchange of valuable gossip. "How's Julian?" Margaret asked, her eyes sharp despite her casual tone. "Richard mentioned he's been under a lot of pressure lately." I let out a long, theatrical sigh, letting concern color my features. "He's been forgetting things. Little things mostly, but it's starting to worry me. Yesterday, he insisted we met when he was at Harvard, but Julian went to a state school. And last week, he told some clients I never finished college, when I have my MBA from Stanford. I think the stress is really affecting his memory." Jennifer leaned in, her interest clearly piqued. "Memory issues? At his age? The doctor says severe stress can do that," I said, lowering my voice conspiratorially. He's been confused about our finances too, moving large sums of money around without remembering why. I found transfers he couldn't even explain. I'm trying to be supportive, but honestly, it's frightening. Margaret touched my hand sympathetically. You poor thing. It must be so difficult watching him struggle like that. Within hours, I knew the story would ripple through their networks, each retelling gaining its own dramatic embellishments. Julian's reputation for razor-sharp precision would begin to develop hairline cracks, with doubt seeping in like water through limestone. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from Isabel. I answered in my car, parked at a scenic overlook 20 minutes from home. It's official, she said without any preamble. Full reinstatement as senior partner, 40% stake as originally structured, and a corner office is waiting for you. But here's the interesting part. I've been doing some research. Remember Morrison Industries, the Hartley Group, Pembroke Financial? Julian's failed pitches from last year. Exactly. I've had some informal conversations with all three. They're very interested in working with someone who understands exactly where Julian's strategies went wrong. Someone who could offer a corrective approach. My heart rate quickened. You want to target his failures. I want to offer superior solutions to companies that have already seen his limitations. It's not personal, it's just business. The fact that it also happens to be poetic justice is simply a bonus. She outlined the proposal. I would lead a new division specifically designed to capture clients dissatisfied with traditional firms like Julian's. My insider knowledge of his methods, combined with my own strategic expertise, would give us an insurmountable advantage. When? I asked. Whenever you're ready. But Charlotte, Morrison Industries wants to meet next week. Their CEO, James Morrison, specifically asked for you. Apparently, Diane Foster sang your praises at a conference last month. After the call, I drove to the upscale mall 40 minutes away, where Julian never shopped. In the designer section, I found it. A black Monique Lhuillier gown that cost $14,000. The sales associate's eyes widened when I produced my private credit card, the one linked to my trust fund. Special occasion, she asked while processing the payment. You could say that. At home, I hung the dress in the back of my closet behind some old coats Julian never noticed. Then I stood in front of our bedroom mirror and began to practice. Not my appearance, but the words I would say at his company gala next week. Thank you all for this warm reception. I'm delighted to announce the reopening of Apex Strategy Partners in partnership with Rossi Associates. We've already secured 3 major clients, including Morrison Industries. I refined each phrase, calibrating my tone to be professional, confident. The voice of a woman who had never been diminished. The voice Julian had spent 7 years trying to erase. My phone buzzed with a text from Laura Chen. Papers are ready for service. Process server is on standby for your signal. Everything was converging toward a single brilliant point, like light focused through a lens. The gala was in 5 days. Julian would receive his Partnership Achievement Award, the recognition he had craved for years. He would stand at that podium, basking in applause, probably telling another demeaning story about his devoted wife. But this time would be different. This time, when he called me his achievement, I would show everyone exactly whose achievement was about to be dismantled. I prepared dinner that evening with unusual care, each dish perfect, each detail precisely as Julian preferred. He arrived home late, lost in preparation for his moment of triumph, barely acknowledging the effort. The gala is Tuesday, he reminded me unnecessarily. Wear something appropriate, not too flashy. And you know how you get carried away sometimes. Of course, I replied, thinking of the $14,000 gown hidden in our closet. I know exactly what to wear. He nodded, satisfied with my compliance, and returned to his phone. I watched him for a moment, this man who had systematically tried to erase me, who had built his confidence on the foundation of my diminishment. He had no idea that the very ground beneath his feet had already shifted, that the walls of his carefully constructed narrative were about to collapse. Tuesday couldn't come soon enough. Tuesday arrived with an unseasonable warmth, the kind that made flowers bloom too early and left everyone feeling slightly off-kilter. I spent the morning at my office, my real office, reviewing the Morrison Industries contract one last time, while Julian believed I was at the spa, preparing for his big evening. The irony was not lost on me that he had given me extra cash for my hair and makeup, unknowingly funding the very transformation that would bring his world crashing down. The Fairmont Hotel's grand ballroom glittered with the kind of understated elegance that whispered money rather than shouting it. I arrived separately from Julian, claiming a last-minute nail appointment had run long. In truth, I had needed those extra minutes to steady my breathing, to practice my smile one final time in the car's rearview mirror, and to remind myself that after tonight, I would never have to practice this particular smile again. The cocktail hour was in full swing when I made my entrance. The black Monique L'Huillier gown moved like liquid shadow around me, heads turned, not the polite, dismissive glances I usually received as Julian's accessory, but genuine double takes. The dress was a declaration, and everyone in that room spoke the language of expensive declarations. Julian was near the bar, surrounded by his usual sycophants, his hand gesturing broadly as he told some story that had Richard Sterling roaring with laughter. He hadn't seen me yet. Perfect. I started with Margaret Whitman, who stood with a group of partners' wives near the silent auction tables. Charlotte. My God, that dress, she breathed, her eyes scanning the designer gown with unconcealed envy. Thank you, I said, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Julian doesn't know I bought it. He's been so confused about our finances lately, I didn't want to worry him. Is he still having those memory issues? Jennifer Cross had materialized at my elbow, drawn by the scent of unfolding drama. I sighed, letting a look of deep concern cloud my features. It's getting worse. Last night, he told David from accounting that I was his secretary before we were married. His secretary? Can you imagine? I was actually consulting for Fortune 500 companies when we met, but he seems to have completely rewritten our history. It's like he's forgotten. The women exchanged glances, the kind that would precede a flurry of text messages and lunch reservations. I moved through the room with strategic precision, stopping at Richard Sterling's group next. Julian's senior partner stood with several board members, their wives hovering on the periphery of their business talk. "Richard," I said warmly, extending my hand. He took it, his expression puzzled but polite. "Charlotte, you look different tonight." "Thank you." I wanted to look my best for Julian's big moment. I paused, then added with calculated casualness, "Though I do worry about him. He's been under such immense pressure. Did he mention he's been calling my MBA program a hobby course? Stanford might be disappointed to hear their graduate degree described that way." Richard's eyebrows shot up. "You went to Stanford?" "Class of 2014. Graduated with honors." I smiled softly. But Julian prefers to forget that. He's been telling people I never even finished college. The stress has really taken a toll on his memory. I left Richard to process this new information and found Victoria near the windows. She watched me approach with something like eager anticipation in her eyes. "You're really doing it," she said quietly. "Doing what?" I asked, though we both knew. "Whatever it is you're about to do, you're glowing with it." She touched my arm briefly. "Good for you." The dinner bell chimed, and we moved to our assigned tables. Julian finally noticed me as I approached our table. His eyes widened at the sight of the gown before his expression soured into irritation. "What are you wearing?" he hissed under his breath. "That is not the dress we discussed. I thought you'd like it," I replied calmly, taking my seat. "It is a special occasion, after all." The dinner proceeded with its usual rhythm of self-congratulatory speeches and polite, unenthusiastic applause. Julian kept shooting me furious glances, clearly unsettled by my dress, by the way other men were looking at me, by something in the atmosphere he couldn't quite pinpoint. Finally, the moment arrived. The firm's CEO stood to announce the Partnership Achievement Award. Julian straightened his tie, his face assuming the expression of humble surprise he had practiced in our bathroom mirror. This year's recipient has shown exceptional dedication to our firm's core values, the CEO read from his note cards. Julian Vance has consistently demonstrated what it means to be a leader in our organization. Julian rose to a thunderous ovation, making his way to the stage with measured, confident steps. He accepted the Crystal Award, holding it up to catch the light before stepping up to the microphone. "Thank you all so much for this incredible honor," he began, his voice dripping with the false modesty he had perfected. "I couldn't have done any of this without support, particularly from my wife, Charlotte." He found me in the crowd, gesturing for me to stand. "She's been my biggest supporter, following me every step of the way. I often joke that I'm her greatest achievement." I stood up slowly, the entire room's attention shifting to me like a physical force. "Actually, Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the now silent ballroom, "I have an announcement of my own." The silence deepened, becoming electric. Julian's smile froze on his face. "I'm delighted to announce that Apex Strategy Partners is reopening." I let that sink in before continuing. "In fact, I've been running it quite successfully for the past month. We've already secured 3 major new clients: Morrison Industries, the Hartley Group, and Pembroke Financial." A collective gasp rippled through the room. These were all companies that had famously rejected Julian's proposals in the last year. Julian's face had gone a sickly shade of pale. "Charlotte, what are you—" "Oh, and that charming story you love to tell about how we met," I continued, my voice as steady as steel. "Let me share the actual version. You pursued me for 6 months after I gave a presentation, your own CEO called Revolutionary. You sent flowers to my office every single day. You begged me for coffee 43 times. I have the emails. You called me the most intelligent woman you had ever met. It's a shame you forgot that woman existed the moment you thought you owned her." The ballroom was holding its breath. Julian stood frozen at the podium, his award hanging limply from his hand like a dead weight. "I won't take up any more of your celebration," I said, gathering my clutch from the table. "Congratulations on your achievement, Julian. I'm sure it will keep you company." I walked toward the exit with measured steps, my heels clicking on the marble floor in the absolute silence. As I passed their table, Megan mouthed the words, "Thank you," tears welling in her eyes. Richard Sterling gave me a slow, deliberate nod of what looked like respect, possibly even admiration. Victoria Blackwell began to clap, a single person at first, then joined by another and another, until a scattered, hesitant applause followed me all the way to the doors. Behind me, Julian's voice finally cracked through the microphone. "Charlotte, wait!" But I didn't wait. I had waited for 7 years. That was more than enough. The doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the explosion of voices that erupted in my wake. The valet already had my car waiting. I had called ahead, knowing exactly when I would need to leave. As I drove away from the Fairmont, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 7 years, the woman looking back was someone I recognized. The city skyline stretched out before me through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new office, the dawn painting it in shades of gold and infinite possibility. My phone sat face up on the desk, Julian's name flashing on the screen as call after call went straight to voicemail. 17 messages had piled up overnight. I pressed play on the first one as I sipped coffee from a simple white mug, mine chosen by me without considering anyone else's opinion. "Charlotte, what the hell was that? Call me immediately." His voice was tight with impotent rage. The second, "This is ridiculous. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. We need to talk." By the fifth, his tone had shifted. "Please, just answer. We can work this out." The 10th, "I'm sorry, okay? Is that what you want to hear?" The 15th, "You can't just throw away 7 years like this." And the last one, recorded at 4:47 a.m., was just a single, desperate word: please. I deleted them all with a single swipe of my finger, then blocked his number. The ensuing silence felt like the first clean breath after being held underwater for too long. Laura Chen called at 9 o'clock sharp. The process server delivered the papers an hour ago. Julian signed for them at his office. How did he react? According to my contact, he tried to refuse them at first. Then he apparently threw them across his desk and demanded to speak to you. Laura paused. His lawyer called me 20 minutes later. Daniel Reeves. Daniel. His friend, the one who had helped him hide assets, who had drafted those emails about keeping me dependent. The irony was exquisite. What did Daniel say? That Julian wants to contest everything. But here's the beautiful part. I sent him our complete evidence file, the financial transfers, the email intercepts, the recordings, everything. Laura's voice was filled with deep satisfaction. Daniel called back 10 minutes later, suggesting mediation. Within a week, Julian's entire position had crumbled. The firm had launched an internal investigation after several partners' wives reported his comments about my supposed mental instability, combined with the spectacular scene at the gala. Richard Sterling personally called to apologize for not seeing the situation sooner, carefully avoiding any admission of legal liability while making it crystal clear that Julian's career track had been permanently derailed. The mediation took place in a sterile conference room with beige walls and fluorescent lights that made Julian look gray and small. He sat across from me, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear while Laura calmly presented our terms. "My client is prepared to walk away with only what she brought into the marriage," Laura stated, plus her documented share of joint assets prior to Mr. Vance's unauthorized transfers. In exchange, we require no contest to the divorce, no claims on Apex Strategy Partners, and a permanent no-contact order. Julian's jaw clenched. "She built that company during our marriage. I have rights." "Actually," I interrupted, my first words to him since the gala, "I built it before we met. I maintained it during our marriage. And I rebuilt it despite your sabotage. You have no rights to anything I created." He stared at me as if he were seeing a complete stranger. Perhaps he was. Daniel whispered furiously to Julian, showing him something on his laptop, probably the recording where Julian had explicitly outlined his plan to keep me financially dependent. Julian's shoulders slumped in defeat. "We accept the terms," Daniel said quietly. 3 months later, I stood in our expanded office space, watching Isabel direct the installation of a conference table that could seat 20. We'd outgrown our original suite in just 6 weeks, our client list expanding faster than either of us could have imagined. "Morrison Industries wants to increase their retainer," Isabel announced, popping a bottle of Dom Perignon that cost more than Julian had ever allowed me to order at a restaurant. And guess who called this morning? Richard Sterling. He wants to jump ship from Julian's firm and bring his entire portfolio with him. I accepted a glass of champagne, the bubbles rising like tiny effervescent celebrations. What about Julian? Richard mentioned he's been encouraged to pursue other opportunities. Apparently, his last 3 presentations were unmitigated disasters. Clients said he seemed distracted and unprepared. She raised her glass. "To karma." "To freedom," I corrected, and we clinked our glasses. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it, but something made me look. It was from Julian. He'd gotten a new phone trying to circumvent my block. I see now what I lost. 5 simple words that might have meant something once. But as I read them, I realized the fundamental flaw in his thinking. He believed he had lost me, as if I were a possession that had slipped through his fingers. The truth was simpler and far more devastating. He had never truly known me at all. He had married a woman he immediately began to diminish, and now he was mourning the loss of a fantasy that had only ever existed in his own insecure imagination. I deleted the message without a reply and turned back to the wall where my degrees now hung proudly beside my professional awards, no longer hidden away in a dusty storage unit. The nameplate on my door read Charlotte Hayes, CEO, in bold letters that caught the morning sun. My mother visited the office that afternoon, bringing homemade cookies for the staff and tears of pride that she didn't even try to hide. "There you are," she said simply, touching my face. "There's my daughter." Megan, who now worked as my executive assistant, knocked and entered. "Your 3 o'clock is here. Richard Sterling." Richard entered with a respectful nod, with no trace of the condescension he'd always shown when I was just Julian's wife. "Charlotte, thank you for seeing me. I have a proposition that might interest you." As we sat and discussed his company's needs and how Apex strategy could serve them, I caught my reflection in the window. A woman in a suit that fit perfectly, chosen by her own hand, sitting in her own office, building her own empire. The best revenge hadn't been the public humiliation or the swift divorce or even the professional triumph. It was simpler and more complete than any of that. The best revenge was becoming myself again. Not the self Julian had tried to erase, but an even stronger version. One who had survived his diminishment and emerged not just intact, but transformed. Julian had once called me his achievement, as if I were something he had crafted. But achievements aren't crafted by others. They're earned through our own strength, our own resilience, and our refusal to accept anything less than we deserve. And this achievement, this life I was building, belonged to no one but me. If this story of calculated revenge resonated with you, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Charlotte stood up at the gala and revealed she'd already secured Julian's rejected clients. What was your most satisfying moment? Share it in the comments below. Want more stories of people reclaiming their power and turning the tables on those who wronged them? Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. End of story.